Okay, let's begin. And first, try to orient ourselves within the letter. 2 Corinthians is a complex book, and not nearly, probably not half as popular as the prequel, you might say, 1 Corinthians. But if you know anything about it, you probably know some of the verses that we just read. So far in the letter, Paul has spent quite a bit of time defending his intentions and status as an apostle. And it's not hard to imagine why his authority would come under fire. The early church is coming into its own, and some think that Paul's not Jewish enough, that he's not interested enough in following the law of Moses or in upholding Jewish traditions. But others, and mostly Gentiles, mostly the crowd that he's writing to now, are concerned with the exact opposite, that he is too Jewish. Their tendency as Greeks is to pull the gospel into a more philosophical direction, to untether it from the Old Testament, to combine it with their own pagan wisdom traditions, and as a result, to make following after Jesus into some kind of subtle intellectual exercise. They want their Jesus with a healthy dose of stoicism on the side. And so Paul has lots of work in front of him. He's writing to people that already know him and have gathered together as a Christian community, but he knows that they're struggling with some of the basics of the faith. And that's what I want to focus on quickly tonight. 4 big ideas that Paul attempts to address here in chapter 5. And these big ideas are just that, but they're things that you and I are liable to misunderstand and misconstrue if we're not careful, just like the Corinthians that Paul is writing to. They're written there on your handout in my very sophisticated outline, probably the most complex outline you've ever seen. Death, judgment, faith, and witness. So death. This is where he starts the chapter, but it's actually been a discussion in 2 Corinthians all along. One of the hang-ups for the Corinthian believers has been the frustrating way that following Christ has not yet freed them from suffering and decay. And so I'm using the word death pretty broadly because Paul's not dealing just with physical death, but with all the struggles and frustrations and unglamorous things related to mortal life. These Christians thought that following Jesus would mean they'd be protected from pain. But that is not what they've experienced. As they've gotten to know him better, in fact, they've learned that being a Christian is actually not a transcendent, glorious thing at all. Even Paul and his companions are bogged down with messy, practical problems. Christians around them are facing persecution and threats. The reputation of the church is bleak, and the community is a collection of needy misfits. So even if it was easy to ignore at first, it has now become quite clear that following the crucified Messiah involves one's own crucifixion. Or to put it in another way, Christianity is fraught with death. And the Corinthians thought that they were giving all that up when they received the gospel. In response, Paul has been gentle and direct. Back in chapter 4, he says this, talking about himself and the other apostles. He said, "We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may also be revealed in our mortal body. So then, death is at work in us, but life is at work in you." He wants the church to know that following Jesus might sometimes take the shape of death, but that's only because it's the shape of Jesus' own journey to the cross. And so following him is not about a decision to ignore death or rise above it somehow. Rather, it's a kind of confidence that even in death, God's promises for us hold true. There's resurrection life to be found right on the other side, even when the trappings of death, the ugliness of an earthly life, the derision and the scorn of society around the church, the present weakness, as some of you have seen your translators of Scripture have labeled chapter 4 just before this. Those things are part and parcel of what it actually looks like to follow Jesus where he's going. It looks like down and not up. And here in chapter 5, he talks about all of this in terms of an earthly tent and dwellings. And he's actually not talking about places. He's talking about our bodies. He says that we're groaning and that we're burdened and that we long for what is mortal to be swallowed up by life. Friends, do you feel that? Do you feel the brokenness of your own body? Do you grieve the brokenness of those around you? Do you feel deep down somewhere that it is not as it should be? Do you want it all to just go away? Paul's comfort for the Corinthians and his comfort for you and I, who are also burdened by death, is that God has already, even now, established eternal houses for us. We didn't build them ourselves, but he's made them for us. Some of you probably caught the allusion there to Genesis, because it's not only that we're changing clothes from earthly to non-earthly garments, so to speak, it's that we're clothing our nakedness. And in the garden, our nakedness was a sign of our shame and our guilt. And those are other elements of death that are caught up in this world that is fading away. But the situation isn't hopeless, because even if we can't move in just yet, God has prepared new bodies so that we can put on immortality, as Paul puts it in 1 Corinthians. Death might appear like it has the final say, but it doesn't, and its end is assured. All right, let's move on to the second idea here, which is judgment. If you're following along with me through the text, it might feel like judgment is a bit of an imposition or an interruption in Paul's thought process. It shows up suddenly there in verse 10. Basically, Paul's been talking about death and the suffering that we all experience in our bodies, but then he goes on to suggest that even though being at home in our bodies feels like we're away from the Lord, obedience still matters. Life in our bodies and the kind of life that we live still matters. Did you catch that in verse 9? So we make it our goal to please him, he says, whether we're at home in the body or away from it, he says. In fact, living rightly, pleasing God, matters so much that God himself has promised to hold us accountable. He says we must all appear before the judgment of Christ, the judgment seat of Christ, so that each of us may receive what is due us for the things done while in the body, whether good or bad. There are several important things here that we just can't miss. First, Paul is not blaming our bodies for the problem of death. He's not arguing that at root our embodiedness is the problem, and that someday when God redeems us, he'll disembody us and disentangle us, and therefore he'll solve the issue. That is a temptation of the Greek Christians in Corinth because they've been reading too much Plato. But it's not a Christian doctrine. Not at all. And if you think about it, it wouldn't make sense of what he's already told us about death and already proclaimed to us about Jesus. So to be clear, Christianity, if Christianity was about freedom from the body, the good news of the gospel would be nirvana. Right? It would be bodilessness. It wouldn't be the resurrection of the dead. God wouldn't be solving anything with resurrected bodies if bodies were the problem. And yet that's precisely what he does. So understand it clearly. Paul believes in an eternal, embodied existence. And really that is why judgment must take place. God must judge the embodied world because his goal is not to get rid of it, but to restore it. And his judgment is not some emotional reaction. It's not some kind of flippant response. Nor is God acting as you and I might, just purely retributively. Or maybe just because he's mean-spirited or spiteful or just seeks revenge against evil. No, God judges for one reason, and that's because God is just. I think this is a fascinating idea, but like everyone else, I assume, The judgment of God doesn't typically make me feel happy. It's not a warm, fuzzy, comforting thing that I lie awake at night thinking about. And for that reason, it's really easy to ignore. But the evil in the world, now that is a problem that we love to talk about, isn't it? We love to argue about who's to blame and what can be done to solve injustices and right wrongs, just as long as we are not implicated somehow ourselves. But that might be a way, actually, of appreciating Paul's comments here. God must judge because the world is broken. And somehow, deep down at least, you and I know that he must hold evil accountable if he's going to fix it. It might not be the most rosy, good-feeling thought at first, but it's the only way through without God abandoning his justice. And so even if it's unsettling as a thought, it's at least reassuring that God is on the case. That what we know to be broken, God will not stop until he solves. And those who we see getting away with evil will not get away with it forever. It will all be accounted for. Or to put it another way, what you and I feel as incredulity or frustration or maybe even hatred at times, God feels as righteousness. And without any bias or partiality, God will bring true justice to bear, and that will be how he restores us. The third idea is faith. If you look at verse 7, you'll see a very important affirmation. Paul writes, "For we live by faith and not by sight." And the reason I put this third is that in Paul's mind, it's crucial for us as we think about the other concepts that we've already walked through. Death and judgment. Remember, the Corinthians are intellectuals. They're tempted to disembody everything. Yes, I have some sympathy for the Corinthians, if you're wondering. And to make following Jesus into this intellectual exercise. That's what the Corinthians are after. And that's because they're coming from an exceedingly rational kind of world. It's where philosophy comes from, right? Especially Greek philosophy. It's the way that we unfold and extrapolate ideas with logic and build out an understanding of the world based on, as Paul might say, what we can see, what seems reasonable, what seems self-evident. But Christianity, friends, is no philosophy. And that's not the Christian way of life. No, as Paul reminds the church in Corinth and us, we live by faith and not by sight. We live not according to what we feel and sense and witness around us, but we live according to what we have apprehended as reality in God's work through Jesus. And no, that doesn't mean that we abandon rationality altogether. It's just that faith requires us to view our lives from a basis in very different suppositions. And retaining that perspective requires energy on our part. We have to remind ourselves what is true and what is not true. Faith is a way of viewing life, and we have a choice to make. We can, as Paul says later on in verse 16, regard reality from a worldly point of view, or we can become convinced by Christ's love, as he puts it in verse 14. And our decision has implications, like I said, for how we understand death and judgment. Because without faith, the life of death that we experience in following Jesus makes little sense. The demands of Christ are uncompromising because he will require everything from you. The promises of Christ are impractical because he will not guarantee you any measure of physical provision or prosperity. In the persecution and the loneliness that you might feel, even as a direct result of giving him everything, that may not make much sense without faith. And all of that is true for the Corinthian believers too. The threat of religious persecution is real. They could easily die for proclaiming that Jesus is Lord, and yet faith provides them with a very different perspective. The burden is light. The provision is sufficient. And so ultimately, the follower of Jesus must concede, along with Paul, that Christianity is an act of faith, not of sight. You see what I mean? I think it's what Paul intends when he writes verse 14. For a people who are struggling with death. And man, I feel that. He announces he is convinced that Jesus died for all, and therefore all have died. And he died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them and was raised again. That's Paul's starting point. Not persecution, not imprisonment, not suffering, not all of the burdens of our mortality, or the groaning that we feel in our bones as we see ourselves and our world falling apart. Not Paul's struggling to get money together to send to the church in Jerusalem. None of the practical trappings of death. No, his starting point is the grace of God. His starting point is asserting by faith alone that God has done something existence-altering in Jesus. And that the whole world spins on that axis. The whole world is implicated in his death. Did you notice those words? All. Such that we have hope even when facing pain and judgment and death. Which takes us to the final theme, witness. There are a few places in 2 Corinthians 5 that stand out as calls to action, appropriate responses as those who've become convinced. I really like that expression. Those who've become convinced by Christ's love, you might say. And the first comes there in verse 9, where Paul again says, we make it our goal to please him. And he's just mentioned the deposit of the Spirit. It's a strange way to talk about the Spirit, but you can think about it almost like God making a down payment on something. God has given us a down payment of his Spirit before that we receive the full resurrection of the dead. And then he mentions this desire to please God. And so I don't think it's a stretch to understand him here in reference to the Spirit's fruit. And I don't mean anything overly complicated by this either, just that one appropriate response to the gospel as Christians, even in the face of death and judgment, is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. I forgot my song in my head. We should live lives that are characterized by the Spirit's fruit in us, and his fruit, not our deeds. That's the first place that we see a kind of imperative here, working in 2 Corinthians 5. But the second one comes in verse 11. He writes, since then, we know what it is to fear the Lord. Remember, he's just talked about judgment. He says, we try to persuade others. But that thought really carries down even through the final section of the chapter. And one of his most important passages, I think, maybe in all of Paul's letters. Beginning in verse 16, he says, so from now on, we regard no one from a worldly point of view. Though we once regarded Christ in this way, why would we regard Christ that way? Because of his death. Because of his humiliation. Because of the shameful way that Jesus died. We do not regard him that way any longer. Therefore, if anyone was in Christ, the new creation has come. The old is gone. The new is here. All of this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave to us the ministry of reconciliation. These are probably the words that you remember from 2 Corinthians 5. But do you see how he's returning back to those original words about our bodies and our dwellings and about the shadow of death that hangs over us? Without faith, we'd be led to the conclusion that all is lost. Without faith, there is no hope. We just crumble under hardship. Suffering would have no meaning. Death would be all around us. But in faith, we know, even if we can't yet experience it, that the old is gone and the new has come. We're not waiting on that. It's here. It's right before us. So don't listen to your eyes, you might say. But I digress, because that's not where the command lies. The command, what Paul's asking us to do, is to view other people in light of this incredible work that Jesus has accomplished for us. To persuade others about the fear of the Lord, that God is just. And that justice is not anxiety-inducing. That justice is hope-inducing. And the word he uses famously to describe all this work is reconciliation. And reconciliation is a social word, right? It's a word that describes peace between two warring parties. There in verse 18, he calls it the ministry of reconciliation. But that's not all, because in verse 19, he calls it the message of reconciliation. And so his ambassadors, as he puts it, were given both a message and a ministry, which is pretty much a good way to sum up all of Christian witness into two words. On the one hand, we proclaim a message that God has done these amazing things. And on the other, we instantiate that message through the ways that we live and move in the world and relate to others. Both are vital. We can proclaim the gospel, friends, with our words, but withhold reconciliation from our neighbors. And we can be conciliatory and kind and gracious with everyone, and yet never announce the work of Christ and the forgiveness of sins. And one without the other is always too little. We have to do both, message and ministry. Let me conclude like this, because even though we've just about scratched the surface of 2 Corinthians 5, maybe, we've done so only because we've neglected some of the personal and historical dimensions of the chapter. Like I said at the beginning, in a very practical sense, Paul's concerned with his credibility. The Corinthians are suspicious. And because they're suspicious, they are flaky in their commitments to Jesus and in their commitments to Paul's teaching about Jesus. And it's in that context that Paul gives us verses 11 and 12. He says, what we are is plain to God. And he's talking about himself and his comrades, his missionaries, who are going around sharing the gospel. He says, what we are is plain to God, and I hope it's also plain to your conscience. In other words, God knows we're not trying to manipulate you. We didn't come up with this message to make a buck. We're not trying to commend ourselves to you again, he says. But listen to this phrase. But we are giving you the opportunity to take pride in us so that you can answer those who take pride in what is seen rather than what is in the heart. That strikes me tonight as such a rich and valuable phrase. He wants the Corinthians to trust him, but not because of his own benefit, not because of his advancement in his career. You know, he wants to work up the apostle ladder, and he just needs a few more good surveys. No. He wants them to trust him so that when they go out into the world he's been describing, this world that is falling apart at the seams, they can be skillful in pointing others in the right direction. They can identify those who take pride in what is seen and point them to the importance of what is discerned only in relation to Jesus by faith. Friends, no matter what you are suffering with, no matter what seems self-evident to you from the vantage point of your own eyes, to live outside of the conviction that Jesus has changed everything is to fall prey to a lie. It is to live in an abstraction. It's to be an ostrich. It's to stick your head in the sand. Only Jesus' work for you is the reality for you. And no, all other ground is sinking sand, we might sing together. And so I pray that we'd heed Paul's warning here and we'd embrace the journey of faith instead. Would you pray with me? Father, thank you for these powerful words that you have spoken to us through your faithful servant, Paul. Lord, and then you've taken them up, and you now speak fresh things to us. Your Spirit is here, revealing things to us all over the room. And I pray that it would not return void. Father, even as we've proclaimed your word, I pray that in the discussions around the table and in the lives led, Thursday through to next week, Lord, I pray that these things would take root in us, that they would change us. We love you, and we ask all these things in your Son's name. Amen.